We turn to Gareth Porter, historian, investigative journalist, and national security policy analyst. Thank you so much for joining us today. And so first we want to talk about, the Russian deputy foreign minister has come out and said the U.S.-led coalition attack on the Syrian government is an act of aggression, possibly a breach of international law. And they've come out further to say that the U.S. is trying to defeat ISIS, but actually help them, that this was a counter-terrorism policy. What are your thoughts? Do you agree?
Well, there are some serious problems, clearly, with the U.S. posture in the Syrian conflict at this point. It's not only the Russians who have raised questions about the legitimacy and the wisdom of the U.S. Assertion of its power in this conflict as far as it's gone and as rapidly as it's gone. If you go back now a few weeks, the interesting thing to me is that the U.S. military in Syria seemed very confident that they could assert the right to have exclusive access to this zone around Raqqa, to the exclusion of any Russian or Syrian or allied forces in that conflict. They were wrong, of course. The Syrians were already, with the support of the Russians and the Iranians, were working with the Turks to establish a zone of deconfliction in which they could shift their forces toward the Raqqa part of the national conflict, the conflict in Syria. And that's exactly what they've been doing. They have shifted ground troops, and the Russians have shifted their air power toward the Raqqa front for the last several weeks. So the U.S. made a fundamental miscalculation here, that they could essentially threaten the Russians and the Syrians with a response militarily, and that they would stay away from that front and allow the United States and its Kurdish and Arab allies in that region to go ahead and complete what they hope is the conquest of Raqqa, the recapture of Raqqa from ISIS.
Do you think the U.S. was trying to threaten not just Syria, but Russia as well in that act?
Well, there's no doubt that that was the intention. They expected the Russians would stay away, that they would recognize a unilateral, what they call a deconfliction, U.S. called a deconfliction zone in eastern Syria, from Raqqa south, around the Euphrates River. Now, the Russians are saying quite explicitly now, no, we never agreed to that. That was your unilateral demand, and we never accepted it. And they are now saying, if you stray to the west of the Euphrates, we will shoot down your fighter planes.
So you don't think more de-escalation zones will possibly help in this matter?
Well, we do have to have a de-escalation zone, but it has to be negotiated between the United States and Russia. There's no question about that. And at this point, the problem is that the Trump administration and the Pentagon appear to be taking the posture that we don't need to negotiate with the Russians at this point. Now, I think they're wrong. They're going to have to change that position. And that is precisely what I think Foreign Minister Lavrov is saying at this point.
Well, initially they wanted to, and then now they're getting so much backlash from, politics as usual in Washington that they can't even negotiate with Russia, and in fact, before he came into office, President Trump said that he certainly wanted to, better relations.
Well, there is a problem politically. I think you're right, that the political atmosphere in Washington and in the United States generally has shifted so far to the whatever you want to call it, hysteria about any contact with the Russians, that there is much greater reluctance now on the part of the White House to do that. But I think he's going to have to overcome that. I think we are now at the most dangerous point in confrontation between the United States and the former Soviet Union or Russia since the Cuban Missile Crisis. There's been nothing like this since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that's why there must be really a very sharp reconsideration of U.S. policy in Syria.
And we know that, the U.S., whether it's President Obama or now President Trump, haven't really gotten along with Bashar al-Assad. Do you think the U.S. wants to take down Bashar al-Assad, or do you think that there's still a chance to kind of reconcile those ties?
Well, I think a couple of things are relevant here. First of all, we know that Trump came to office with the intention of not participating in a regime change policy. He made that very clear. Mm-hmm. He was induced to shift his policy by, we don't really understand why, at the point of the Khan Sheikhoun alleged chemical weapons attack, and then immediately made a decision to carry out the Tomahawk strike against the Russian base in Syria. Now, he's still taking that line publicly, but certainly there is very strong reason to reconsider this in light of the consequences of really pushing that too far under the present circumstances. So I think it's a very fluid situation at this moment. And again, I think it's really incumbent on the White House to reconsider its options in light of the fact that they really made what appears to me, at least, to be a very fundamental miscalculation.
I see. And we heard from our reporter Alex over in Canada about the decision to not bring troops into Syria, Canadian troops. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's quite understandable for any state which is not out to intentionally pick a fight with the Russians, that they're not eager to get involved in this situation in Syria. It reminds me a bit of what happened in Afghanistan some years ago, back in 2004, 2005, when the U.S. was trying to pull in NATO countries, other NATO countries, to take over much of the responsibility for opposing the Taliban. And those NATO countries were willing to do it on the assumption that it wouldn't really involve much, if any, combat at all. They were quite wrong about that. The U.S., of course, underestimated the degree to which there was a danger of that. And then I think a number of NATO countries got caught up in a war that they really hadn't anticipated.
So the U.S. basically, you think, needs to take a step back and kind of recalculate the situation?
I hope that will be the case. I can't guarantee it, that's for sure.
I see. All right. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. That's Gareth Porter, historian, investigative journalist, and national security policy analyst. We really appreciate his time.